Let's talk about debugging in R. And debugging is quite an important part of programming in R because a lot of the time when you're programming, you're actually debugging and trying to solve the problems that you encounter. And the way you approach these problems and how you handle them is of large importance to your success in programming. And the sort of depressing truth is actually that almost everything fails initially. At least for me, and I guess I'm not alone. But when you write a long part of code, it usually doesn't work. And what you have to do then is try to figure out why it doesn't work and correct it in such a way that it will work. And when looking at the programming task, choosing the structure of the program and to choose the commands you're going to use and to write the code doesn't take that much time, but actually my experience is that a lot more time is used to debugging, at least when you're dealing with complex tasks. And I think it is important that you don't get disappointed when things doesn't work the first time or immediately, because they are an integral part, the bugs of programming, and they almost should be there, and you have to deal with them. And dealing with them can be quite fun, actually, although it seems improbable. First thing you should do when something doesn't work in R is to actually pay attention to the error message that you usually get, and not just look at it and realize that there's something wrong, but the text itself, the error message usually contains a lot of important information. For example, these are rather common error messages. If you get an unexpected parenthesis, then you probably have written too many, because a lot of code ends with a lot of parentheses upon each other, 3, 4 of them, and if you put 5 there instead of 4, then you get this error message. And so the reasonable reaction to this is to just delete a parenthesis and then look at the result, try to run the code again. When R claims that an argument is missing with no default, then you have missed an argument. These things seem obvious, but you have to look at them. And this one is very common. It's undefined column selected. And this error message, that's what you get when you are trying to subscript an R in a data frame or a matrix, and you just tell R which rows you're interested in. Commonly you're interested in all the columns, but you have to put a comma after the rows in order to tell R that all columns should be selected. If you miss this comma, you get this error message. And an extra argument, this is just an example, extra argument by will be disregarded. This means that you have entered an argument called by, and in this case it might have been a by, spelled by, that you were actually trying to use. And what happens is that it will use the default value for by, and then it will disregard this by that you wrote. So unless you're satisfied with the default value of by, then you will have to delete this and spell it correctly. When you get a plus, that's not really an error message, but it tells you that R is waiting for more input. And usually the problem is that you have missed the parenthesis at the end of the script. And the easiest way to handle this is simply to write extra parenthesis at the end and then run, highlight it and run that single parenthesis, and usually it will work. If you get an NA that's not available, then you might have applied the command on a data set that contains NA values using a command that does not allow NA values, and you will have to figure out a way to get around this. For example, the the command might accept an extra argument such as na remove, which you could set to true and then try to run it again. Another important thing when things doesn't work out the way you plan them to is to not just look at the entire piece of code, but actually to look at it piecemeal, bit by bit, to see where it fails. And in this example, we are trying to calculate the mean value of the ages of females using more than 2 drugs, it seems. So we have the command mean, and we're trying to get the mean of the ages, column age, and the selection from this column will be based on the values in column sex and drugs, but not rock and roll. And if we run this piece of code, we get an error message. We get NA, not available, and we get a warning message. In ops factor drugs, not meaningful for factors. This indicates that this column might be a factor, although we're trying to count the number of drugs and select the patients with more than 2 drugs, so this shouldn't be a factor. So we can start by looking at just this part of the code. Run that. Contains a lot of NAs here, as you can see, the same error message. So we look at just the column, $, drugs. And yes, as you can see, this is not the number of drugs, but some sort of factor with a few levels, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and so forth. But what we wanted was the actual number of drugs, and in this case, it's in a separate column in the dataset, and we just entered the wrong column. So we should have written $drugs.n. We can look at that. Yeah, that's the drugs. And if we run this part of the code, we get a few trues and falses. And if we look at this part, there's also trues and falses. And if we combine them to a united condition, we get this, which looks good. Okay, so now we try again to run it all, and we get an NA. So something is still wrong. We could look at the $age, see what it contains. Yeah, it contains ages, but you see here that we have a few NAs in it. And if we take this part, which would be the ages fulfilling these criteria, then we get a shorter set of ages, and we have an NA there. And as you can see, we're trying to calculate the mean of something containing an NA, which is not allowed. That's why we get NA as result. And what we have to do here is to enter an extra argument, NA remove is true. And when we run it, we get 62.9 approximately, which is the mean age of these patients. Another thing that could be useful when debugging the R scripts is to check class and mode of the data used, because that often poses a problem when the class is incorrect, as in the previous example. You should also read the help text, obviously, texts for the commands you're trying to use, but they will often give insights if you actually look at them. Google things, always useful, and you find surprisingly lots of answers on the internet. Another thing you should do is ask others, at least if you know anyone that knows R, and discuss the solutions, because the input from others is almost always useful. And you could also ask on the internet. There are forums where you could ask. If nothing else helps, you could always try another approach, because everything can be done in multiple ways in R. And if you tried and you don't get it right, then just think of it differently and try another approach. Use a loop instead of apply, or do it differently, and it might work. Okay, good luck.